Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone. Delighted to be here. I've got to say, when I got the invitation to talk on the artist-led, I thought, oh my God, it's been about 15 years since I've done anything artist-led. I'm not sure I've got anything to say. I was 20 years working in and around artist-led projects, and then my son was born. And I sat down with my wife and we talked about we're not going to have as much time as we used to have, so what we're going to cut out. And it was Coronation Street. I'm doing all these artist-led projects. So I decided I'd rather do things at home because I've got this little baby to look after. And so the idea came to me that I would write a book, because you can do that at home. And I thought I could write a book in about 2 years or something like that, and 10 years later the book finally came out. And then 2 years later another book came out, and then I've got another book coming out later on this year. So as he got older and he got more independent, in fact, as I was telling someone over lunch today, at one point last year he turned to me and said, I don't need you anymore. He's 13. So I said, obviously, next time you need a lift, remember that. And so I've been writing books, not doing artist-led projects. So what I wanted to do was to try and draw out some of the things that I've been writing about that I think have a relationship to political, theoretical, historical questions around the artist-led. And so I wanted to just say a little bit about what kind of writing I do, because to be honest, at the beginning I wasn't sure what kind of writing I did. I thought I was going to write art theory, whatever that is, and it turns out what I'm doing is historical re-narrativization. Somebody else had to tell me that that was what I'd done, but basically what I'm doing is I'm going into a kind of deep historical reconstruction of how we ended up doing what we do and thinking what we think in the art world today. And these deep historical reconstructions are an attempt, in a sense, to kind of shift the perspective so that we're not looking at it in the conventional, customary ways that we normally think of what we're doing. I kind of try and give a slightly different perspective on how we might think about what we're doing. So, and the word re-narrativization comes from Stuart Hall. So I effectively approach contemporary issues historically. And this usually begins as a kind of recontextualization of current discourses. I identify patterns of thinking, and then I link these patterns of thinking to the emergence of certain specific social configurations. Now, in an old-fashioned Marxist sense, that would be very straightforward. You'd say, that is a bourgeois idea, or that is an aristocratic idea, and you'd just link it directly to some period, or you'd link it directly to some class position or something like that, and I don't do that. What I do is look at institutional emergencies, look at infrastructural changes, and see how discourses and infrastructures emerge together. And so my response to the question, what we don't talk about when we talk about the artist-led, is to think about where the concept of the artist was formed, under what conditions, why, and what implications has that had for us now. I'm going to start actually with a reference to Jason Bowman, who ran a research project from Varland Academy, where I used to work, called Stretched, and Stretched was a research project about the artist-led. And during one of the symposiums that he held, he said, we think about the artist-led as coming out of 60s and 70s alternative space movements. And he said, but we can go back further than that. And the example that he gives is Joseph Wright of Derby in the 17th century rented a room in Covent Garden between April and June 1785 to exhibit his paintings in direct rivalry with the Royal Academy. This is a moment of the artist-led. This is prior to the 1960s. What I do in the book that I've got coming out later this year, which is called Art and Labour, is I actually go through this period in quite some detail and look at a range of ways in which we think of the artist-led. So Jason's example is of an artist-led exhibition. And an exhibition is a key technique of the artist-led, both then and now. But there were other techniques. And what I do is I try to understand why these particular techniques emerged at that time. And we can look at, there are art historians are very knowledgeable about various artists using these techniques. William Blake, Jacques-Louis David, William Hogarth, Anthony van Dyck. But the techniques were not just about exhibiting. Exhibiting was also not exhibiting in the way that we understand it. I'll give you an example from Jacques-Louis David from the end of the 18th century. After the French Revolution, both the guild and the academy were abolished. So artists were then in a bit of a sticky situation. They'd always drawn their income and always had their opportunities through these institutions. So if you didn't have patrons, or your patrons had just had their head chopped off, or your patrons had now gone to England, if all of your sources of income had gone, what do you do? And Jacques-Louis David came up with the idea, he said he's borrowed the idea from England, of what's called in English an exhibition. And an exhibition for him was you present a painting or a suite of paintings by hiring a room, you present that to the public, not to a patron, and instead of them buying the work the way that a patron would buy the work, they pay an entrance fee, a very small entrance fee, so everybody can afford to go and see this painting. And you hire this room for 5 years. And over 5 years, he earned enough money from people paying a small amount of money to go and see his painting that he could buy an estate. So from a certain point of view, it worked. But his rivals in the art world in Paris accused him of being venal, of being greedy, of now selling his art for money, even though obviously he owned the art. He kept that at the end of the process. But there seemed to be a relationship to money that his peers who had also been part of the academy looked down on. That's an important moment, but it's also within the history of the artist-led. But it's also a very difficult moment to understand in its context. So, for instance, the great Brazilian art critic Luiz Renato Martins simply says the painter becomes a private entrepreneur and the market becomes their judge under these circumstances of exhibiting works and getting your income from that rather than patrons. And the fee-paying exhibition then seems, from our perspective, to be a kind of capitalist enterprise, and the artist, therefore, as an entrepreneur. I'm going to tell a slightly different story than that. But before I do, I want to just indicate that there were other techniques as well. This is, in a sense, this era is the birth of what we call the exhibition, and it's born out of the very specific situation of losing all of your art institutions and trying to invent ones for yourself. But it's not the only technique that people used at the time. So, for instance, Hogarth would put an advert in a newspaper and ask people to subscribe, that is, to pay in advance, in order for him to make a set of prints which they would then own. So he would, you would you would pay 3 shillings to subscribe to the Bear Street Gin Lane print set. You would pay 6 shillings for Industry and Idleness, and 12 shillings for a later one. And the amount that you needed to subscribe did vary, and Hogarth was very selective, thinking this print might be the kind of print that someone with very little money would want, so I'm going to charge less for that one. And then I've got these other prints that maybe people with more money would want, and I'm going to charge more for them. So he had a kind of a range of prices for subscribing to these prints. And by subscribing, he has no patron, but somebody else is paying for him to produce these things, which were very expensive to produce. But also subscription was not unusual. Subscription was how hospitals were built, for instance. So he was borrowing an economic technique that was common at the time, but was not common within art. And there were other techniques, but I'm not going to have time to talk about them all. Now, what I want to do is to go back at that point and see the Guild and the Academy have lost their legitimacy. What artists at this particular moment took the economics of their practice into their own hands, and they set up their own exhibition structures, set up their own financial structures, and so forth. So the artist-led emerges. This particular version of the artist-led emerges at the point when the institutions have collapsed. Now, the modernist story of this moment, which is kind of in one version of it, is the birth of modernism. The modernist story is that the artist-led, therefore, comes out of that moment when artists are liberated from arts institutions. But if we look carefully again at what the Guild and the Academy were, we can describe them both as artist-led institutions. So the Guild, and not just for painters and sculptors, but the Guild for all artisans, were producer-led. They were organisations that you could only join if you'd passed your apprenticeship, and all of the people that were making the regulations and policing the regulations were themselves what they called freemen. Freemen are people who had gone through the apprenticeship and made it to the other side, and then had become a full member of the Guild. So the Guilds were always already producer-led institutions. Nobody else had any right to say anything or do anything in relation to what artisan guilds did. Now then, the academies, the academies of fine arts, for instance, there were academies of literature before that, but the academies of fine art that emerged in the 17th century were, maybe you could describe it as a secession from the guild. So basically, guild members decided that they wanted a different kind of organisation. And this organisation would be run by themselves, and they called it the Academy. The difference between the Guild and the Academy, which are very important, and I'll go into in a second, is effectively that you get a dual system. The Guild and then the court-based academy. So the Academy had a royal affiliation, and the Academy was given privileges by the king. So first of all, it's important to note that the academies were produced out of the Guild and were produced on the model of the Guild, which is to say, we're going to set up our own rules, we're going to set up our own ways of doing things, and this again was, if you want to put it in these terms, was an artist-led institution. So the kind of modernist myth that the artist-led comes out of the rejection of the Academy is a kind of short-sighted historical narrative of what it is that we're looking at. Both the Guild and the Academy were artist-led. The reason that we have that myth is that during the 18th century, and then this is followed up in the 19th century and the 20th century, there develops an idea that, first of all, the Guild, and then the Academy, but first of all, the Guild is a kind of restriction on laissez-faire economics. So there's a general critique of the Guild which allows market capitalism to emerge. And the same debates, which are actually about trade and commerce, are then absorbed into discourses of art. So then it appears as if the reason we had to have an academy in the first place is because the guilds were not very good, and the guild painters and sculptors were not very good, and we needed to distinguish between the quality of the academic painters and the lack of quality of the guild painters, because one of the stories of the laissez-faire critique of the guild is that they just weren't very good. And the market will provide much higher quality, much more efficiency, and so on and so forth. So, first of all, the guild is criticised by the people who set up the academy as being kind of uneducated, unsophisticated, traditional, repetitious. Everything's based on copying, everything's based on rote learning, and so on and so forth. And then, in modernism, when the academy is rejected, exactly the same story is told again, only this time it's not the guild that's rote learning and bad and repetitious and so on and so forth, it's the academy. So the academy ends up being accused of all the things that it accused the guild of in the first place. But anyway, so we end up with this myth, right? The myth that everything has always been, medieval, regulated, it's always been low quality until artists are emancipated from all institutions. Individual freedom, laissez-faire. That's what gives us this sense that the artist now in modernity is in some way superior to the artist of the academy or the artist of the guild. So I've got this written down. It's a much shorter paragraph than I just said. The established narrative is that Bohemian, avant-garde and modernist artists in the 19th century rejected the academy and thereby turned themselves against the establishment and the usual means by which artists made a living: patrons, collectors, salons, prizes. However, a new story can be told. The origin of the idea of art's antagonism to commerce is actually the 17th century academy. The academicians went out of their way to cast guild artisans as what they called mechanics. It was a commonly used term for someone who was uneducated but skilled. At the same time, they also reconstituted the fine arts economically, socially and politically. The academies obtained certain privileges from the courts, but also imposed on themselves a battery of prohibitions which are just as significant for us. Mostly historians are looking at the privileges. I'm going to focus on the prohibitions. Together, these privileges and prohibitions delineated the fine arts by elevating them above handicraft. The apprentice master workshop was replaced with an academy that housed scholar painters and scholar sculptors rather than artisan painters and artisan sculptors. One of the ways in which the distinction between the scholar and the artisan was underlined and policed, the most significant one for my reading, is the prohibition which the Royal Academy in Paris established against its members opening, quote, a shop for the sale of his works or to exhibit them in the windows of his house, end quotes. This was a prohibition that was written into the statutes in 1648 and then was rewritten and extended in 1777. This statute proclaimed, those who wish to open a shop and trade in pictures, drawings and sculptures, by their hands or others, to sell colours, paint, gilding, and other accessories of the arts of painting and sculpture, shall be required to leave the academy and join the guild. So just the act of selling a painting meant that you were banned from the academy. And what this means is that the academy, one of the conditions, the prohibitions that made the academy seem superior to the guild is its anti-capitalism. It's an aristocratic anti-capitalist prohibition. It thinks that capitalism is lower than the liberal arts and refined taste. So it wants virtue rather than money. And it thinks that if you try to sell your work, then you have lost your connection to virtue. And therefore, you will be kicked out. So when we're thinking about the emergence, historically, of the very concept of the artist and what the artist, how the artist is differentiated from the craftsperson, the artisan, and the handicrafts in general, this prohibition, it seems to me, is the best illustration we have of how that division signified at this time, which is to say that artisans sell goods to people, to customers, to patrons and so forth. We do not. All right? I mean, this meant inventing new techniques. So, for instance, one of the things that happened was that under the apprentice system, the apprentice would live in the household of the master, and therefore, in that sense, the master is paying in kind the apprentice, but the apprentice is doing work in the workshop which the master profits from. So there's a kind of in-kind wage there. With the academy, something else happens. Students, scholars of the academy, as well as going to the academy didn't teach you anything. It was not supposed to teach anything. All right? But you could have private tuition from your professor, and you would pay them to do that. So academicians would have other streams of income which are not to do with selling paintings. You would sell your time to students. That was one of the ways that you did it. The other would be that you would have a salon every 2 years in Paris, and it was okay to sell works at the salon because you are not showing your work in your house, in your workshop. You're not behaving like an artisan, you're behaving like an artist with a relationship to the public, and the public is a kind of virtuous body. So what this introduces is that it's okay to sell your work if there's an intermediary. Initially, the intermediary is the academy itself, because they house the exhibitions of the salon and they sell it on your behalf. And then after that, we then get the introduction of art dealers, art gallerists, who also intercede on your behalf. They do the selling. You don't do the selling. So if you're not doing the selling, then your virtue's intact. So the concept of the artist in the discourses that emerge in the 17th and 18th century are based on an antagonism between art and commerce. And this antagonism, which we've inherited as being art's long-standing anti-capitalism, is also a form of social differentiation, where artists are elevated above people who work in handicraft, and also people who work in retail, people who work in industrial production, and so on and so forth. And I want us to think about how the artist emerges in this way, because that tells us something about why we value something being artist-led. It's not a comfortable thing to think about, but it's something that I think we have to think about. In other words, there's a long history of that provides us with the values that underpin the idea that the artist-led is a good thing. Like I said, I was 20 years involved in the artist-led, And I'm still committed to it, and I love all of the projects that I've heard about today. I'm still committed to it, but at the same time, I know I've got to go back and rethink what part of the artist-led is it that I'm interested in. And I'll give my little suggestion at the end about how maybe we can rethink the artist-led so it doesn't just express these forms of privilege that were created by the formation of the academy against the guild. Let me see, I'm flipping pages now. Right, okay. I'm going to talk now about the emergence of the studio as a space and as a workplace. And the reason I'm doing this, I'm going to tell you right up front, because otherwise it's boring and pointless. But if you know what the conclusion is, then it might be a bit more interesting. And that is, what I'm going to say is that the artist-led, in my interpretation of it, takes the romance of the studio, the myth of the studio, and puts it inside the breast of the artist, so that they can take that studio with them wherever they go, on the street, in a cafe, in a warehouse, downstairs from an architect's office. All of those things become studio-like, have the qualities of a studio because the artist is there. And so one of the things we have to explain then is this link between the formation of the studio as a space and the formation of the artist as the person who occupies the studio, or if you like, the formation of the artist as that being who is occupied by the logic of the studio. I think it's that way round. So this means going over the same historical ground, because with guild production of paintings and sculptures, you have a workshop, and those workshops are collective, and they don't just contain what we would call the artist, and what art historians certainly call the artist, but what at the time were called the masters or the freemen. They are also populated by apprentices, what we call journeymen, which is from the French, so it just means day labourer, or someone who gets paid by the day. And one that often gets missed out of these accounts, the master's family. So the master runs this workshop, and their wife will be working in the workshop, and their children will be working in the workshop, but they don't get paid, so they don't get onto the lists of people that were working in these workshops quite often, even though we kind of know that happened anyway. So, in the guilds, practice is collective, and everything that you need to make art is made in the workshop. All right? So your apprentices will be making you your brushes, not just doing the background of the painting. Your apprentices will possibly be making you paper, if you're working on paper, which is rarer, but will be preparing the ground. Sheets of wood would be prepared for you to paint on, and they would make that. If you're a sculptor, they would go to a quarry and they would bring you stone. Nothing is bought in, everything is made. All right? There are even stories of people in workshops shaving their cat because they need to make a new brush. All right? That's the level that we're working at here. And so you need all of these people working for you in order to be able to produce something, a painting or a sculpture. When the academy is formed, it's formed against the guild, and it tries to differentiate itself from the guild. And one of the ways that it does it is it pretends that you don't have assistants. Not that you actually don't have assistants. All of the great initial academicians had assistants, but you keep them out of the way. All right, and this was still common practice in the 20th century. So Henry Moore always had assistants, loads of them, and whenever the BBC said they were going to come over to his studio, he gave them the day off. That's what you do, and artists have been doing that since the middle of the 17th century. So there's a myth of being on your own. Now, in the 18th century, there was a division of labour, a social division of labour. So that what happened is artisans would start to make already produced paint, and then the artist would purchase that paint from an art supplier, which was another artisan, who'd gone through the same training but had maybe not made it in some kind of way. And so they started to sell paper, brushes, pencils, all the things that you used to make in the workshop, you can now purchase. That is, I think, within this history, the most significant development in the idea that we have of the artist. From that point onward, you don't need anyone else in the studio with you. It's not because you're doing it on your own. It's because all the things that your assistants used to do for you, you're now buying off a supplier. So there's a spatial gap between the studio and the place of production where all the stuff that used to be produced in the workshop is now being produced. That spatial gap gives you the illusion that you are really on your own. Art is a lonely business. Art is something that is entirely about the individual, and only that individual should decide what goes on in that work. So, because partly, when you make work collectively, someone else has painted the background, someone else paints the clothing, you go in at the end and you paint the face and the hands. There was a myth at the time that it would be better if the artist painted every single inch of this painting, but it wasn't practical. So it didn't happen. But once you were buying in all of these materials and supplies, you didn't have anybody else in the studio to paint the backgrounds and the clothing and do the sky and do all of those kinds of things. You had to do it yourself. But that also gave you the illusion that what makes an artist different from an industrial producer or something like that is that it's entirely individual. And all industrial production is collective, all artisanal production is collective, but art is special because you do it all by yourself. And this is because you buy it. You buy all the stuff that you used to do collectively. In other words, this is still collective production, but it's dispersed spatially, so it doesn't look like collective production, and so you give yourself credit for things that you have not done. Or you overstate the things that you've done as being the only things that matter. The studio, so there's this historical development from the workshop to the studio, and it goes in stages. And what happens initially is that the workshop is divided up, okay? And this happens first in Italy, and so we've got Italian names for these two spaces, the studiolo and the bottega. And the bottega is where the apprentices and the journeymen work, and the family obviously. And the studiolo is where the master or the freeman works. But the difference could be very straightforward. It could be just a difference like this. It could be that he has a desk and nobody else can use that desk, or it could be that there's a curtain that goes across. If you were wealthy enough, what you would do is you put a wall between you, a wall with a window so you can supervise. You put a wall between you and the workers, and then you'd have another door here, just in case somebody from a higher class wants to come and talk to you about buying a work, and you don't want them to walk into the workshop. That brings the whole thing down. Nobody wants to walk in a workshop. So they come in this other way, and then they just experience this lovely studio-like space. And art historians tend to think that what happens after that is that the studiolo is then just cut off from the bottega and we're left with the studio. But that's not quite what happens, because the modern studio, the modern artist studio, is a place not just where you have meetings with collectors, you know, design your work and read books and do all of those things that were done in the studio. Typically, in modernism, it's also a place where you work. So parts of the bottega come into the studiolo. But when they come in as studiolo. In other words, now the mechanical action of making the work suddenly becomes significant. It becomes meaningful. It becomes an expression of who you are. It becomes a sign of freedom, of your individuality, which is the kind of modern version of what was always understood as style. You know, Michelangelo had a style, Leonardo had a style, but when you get into the modern studio, your style becomes your method, not what you've taught your technicians to do. So, so I'm trying to think about the emergence of our values and ideas and assumptions of the artist by looking at, I've done it in two ways, by looking at economic techniques and spatial configurations of artistic production. And what I've tried to explain by doing that is how we get to imagine that artists work on their own. And in a sense, the strength of that belief. Why would that belief be so strong? Why is it so difficult to dismiss that belief, even after, you know, what we've had, you know, something like 40 years of the feminist and Marxist critique of the myth of the artist? Why are we still thinking of the artist in this way? And it's because we still have all of these economic mechanisms and spatial configurations. You know, it's the artist is still living in these conditions. But obviously, there's now, if you want to put it this way, there's now like a new wave of critique of the myth of the artist, and so it's become unacceptable, really, to think about the artist independently of a whole range of what Danny Child calls invisible hands, the invisible hands of artistic production and circulation. In other words, we have these discourses that give credit to the artist for things that other people do. And now, feminism and post-colonial theory require us to disclose the full extent of ancillary work required for the production of art by others, by non-artists. So, in other words, if we talk about the artist's and the artist's relation to the art supplier as just being a spatially exploded version of the workshop in the first place that was collective, then what we're being required to do now, which is absolutely justified, is that we recognise all of these spatially dispersed agencies in the production of any given work of art. So, that leads to certain questions, political questions, I think. When we talk about the artist-led, who are we excluding? When we're talking about the artist-led, are we privileging the artist over the people who the artist depends on? When we talk about the artist-led, to what extent are we, in a sense, preserving 17th and 18th century ideas in a context that is no longer, it is never acceptable, but in a context that is where it is, where you have to violate decades of struggle in order to insist that the artist is the central figure in the production of art. Um, so how can we retain our commitments and our convictions to all of the artist-led projects that we've heard about today and all the other ones that we know about and all the other ones that we don't know about? How can we retain those convictions and yet not contradict them by giving too much emphasis to the artist in social situations where the artist is only a participant, is not the author of world making. My suggestion is that we include the artist-led within a much broader spectrum of, if you want to put it this way, kind of grassroots agencies. Okay, so the artist then becomes an ally of other social agencies. And I'm going to take the example of Alan Sears' theory of infrastructures of dissent in his book, The Next New Left. An infrastructure of dissent is, quote, the means through which activists develop political communities capable of learning, communicating, and mobilizing together. Artists can be, and often are, members of infrastructures of dissent. Quite often, artist-led projects are, in fact, infrastructures of dissent. But I want to put them alongside and together with a whole range of other infrastructures, rather than isolating them and treating them as a special case. And this means, in some instances, there might be they're all, we've heard Emma talk about this earlier on, all the terms we have are shit. But let's say that we have a community institution, right? Like, people have put something together, and that institution contains all kinds of activities from, cooking food together, maybe there's a creche, maybe there's a book group, maybe they play jazz on a Friday night, whatever they do. But also, inside that, there may be some artistic activity run by artists, all right? And what I want to do is to think about that bit of the artist-led within the bigger infrastructure of dissent as not having privilege over the others in that community centre, if that's what it is, or in that community generally. And what I'm getting at is, it might actually be preferable for you to say, this is not artist-led, this is led by everybody here. I'm just part of this community. And to say that it's artist-led is, in a sense, to take credit for some things that you're not doing, like setting up the rest of it. The fact that you've got heating in this room while you're doing your artist-led thing, all the other things that go along with that, all the things that you depend on. So by calling it artist-led rather than community-led or whatever else led, is a form of bias. And so I'm really back to Emma's point again. We do need new terms for this. I'm not going to come up with one today, you'll be glad to know. But we don't need new terms just because we're trying to come up with the right name for it. We need new terms because we are still in a struggle against the entire history of how art was separated from everything else. And so long as we talk about the artist-led, we're losing that struggle. Anyway, I thought I could give 10 minutes for questions as well, so I thought I'll stop here now and see if anybody's got any questions. Thank you. I don't see why not. It would be I would expect that to be raised. The overstatement of the human is connected to the overstatement of the artist, I think, discursively within the way that we've the way that Western philosophy has. It's difficult to pick them out, but on occasion it looks like that Western overstatement of the human is actually based on the concept of the artist, and in other situations. Within artistic discourse in particular, it looks like the concept of the artist is based on some sort of ideal of what it means to be human. So those two concepts are connected, and so if we start to question one, then we're going to have to start questioning the other. Well, I've got a different sort of take on that, which is that, so you've got in the middle of the 17th century in Paris, you get this diktat, no sales. So that's the kind of that's the historical origin, if you like. I think that it is anyway. Certainly, looking in the art historical text, that seems to be the origin for what we now think of as a kind of anti-capitalism that is native to art in some way. But what happens in that moment in the 18th century, which then grows in the 19th century, is that it seems as if art is somehow bypassed by industrialization. All right. So 10 years ago or something, when I was talking about these questions, people in seminars and conferences would say, but art was never industrialized, and it's kind of true. And I would say as well, I agreed with that, because if you just look in the studio, art was never industrialized. But if you look instead at the things that were industrialized, like the production of paintbrushes, as soon as something was industrialized, it left the studio. And they left at different paces. So, the first thing was paint. So then you got your paint in pouches rather than getting someone to make it for you in the workshop. And then, and then it was paint. Then it was paper and brushes and so on, pencils. All of these things then got industrialized, but they got industrialized and therefore left the studio. And so the studio is almost, whatever is left that hasn't been industrialized is what you do in the studio. So in other words, our very concept of the idea that the artist is someone who works on their own in a studio is the direct product of industrialization, of capitalism. So there's then, if you like, a kind of second moment for art's anti-capitalism, really, which is that it starts to feel as if what you're doing in the studio is not capitalist, and what the person supplying you with the brushes is capitalist. Do you know what I mean? So there's a kind of protection, not only, the protection from industrialization is also a protection from capitalism. And so it becomes like this kind of little haven within capitalism, the bit that hasn't been touched, that's what it feels like, but it's completely shaped by capitalism. So my take's slightly sort of about trying to understand how you got the two at the same time. The anti-capitalism and the capitalism were one and the same thing in a way. There was a woman at the back with glasses. Okay, so there's two parts to that which I want to address. One is that art theorists, at least since the 90s, the first one I can think of is 1992, but there were probably others as well, have made an issue of the fact that many artist-led things are not necessarily radical, are not necessarily left-wing, are not necessarily anti-capitalist, and so forth. And the reason I've not talked about that is because that's just a kind of negative repetition of the same myth, which is that you should be anti-capitalist, you should be independent. That's what an artist is, you know what I mean? So I'm not really concerned about that, because it's not a challenge to the original thesis. But the second thing is when the artist-led and infrastructures of dissent come together, what I want to do is I want to extend Alan Sear's insight, and I want to say it's not just about dissent all the time. What he calls infrastructures of dissent, I would want to extend into infrastructures of accountability, infrastructures of solidarity, infrastructures of the celebration of the non-dominant, infrastructures of pageantry, infrastructures of lower class fun, you know, infrastructures of, you know, basically infrastructures that don't just point like satire does only to power. It's not about just pointing to power, it's also about growing what we have. So it's also about, you know, having infrastructures that celebrate what we are rather than just attack what they are, or if, you know, and I'm only saying we and they because it's so multiple that I can't identify it with one particular struggle or another particular struggle. But the struggle, you know, like, so one of the things that I would be critical of Chantal Mouffe about is that she talks about struggle in terms of agonism, and that's always pointing to power. And agonism is only possible if you have solidarity with the other people who are also antagonistic to power. So you need these in a sense, you need infrastructures for things that don't look like they're politically motivated, you know. They are just for you to build a community of resistance. And building a community of resistance is not in itself achieved by resisting. It has to be achieved by other ways, like having meals together. So I want to go beyond that idea of infrastructures of dissent, and therefore I want to think that allows us, I think, to think of a whole range of different models of the artist-led, which is your original point, which isn't to say that, you know, there's a modernist sort of tick that I think we've still not quite got ourselves clear of, which is that there must be one right way of doing everything. You know, there's one right way of being a Trotskyite, there's one right way of being a feminist, there's one right way of opposing the Anthropocene. And we end up having all of these fights amongst ourselves about what's the right way and the wrong way of doing things. And what I want to do is say, we have a multi-dimensional, multi-layered, multi-agentive social system which needs to be dealt with in multiple ways. So there isn't one way of doing it. There's always going to be lots of different ways of doing it. So therefore there must be lots of legitimate forms of artist-led. I'm very suspicious of those kinds of discourses. I remember mentioned Henry Moore already once. I remember being invited to the Henry Moore Institute to talk on a panel, and the title, if I remember, was something like Why We Need Artists to Change the World, or something like that. And I was the last to speak, I think, as I remember it, or maybe I just didn't listen after I spoke. I was so exhausted. But I don't want artists to change the world. I want artists to be part of a much bigger process of changing the world that is not run by artists. And the idea that, go on, if we're going to name some, you know, the idea that Jeremy Deller is going to change the world for me is not appealing to me. You know, there are other people better at it than him, and actually, people doing it in communities, in big groups, people doing it as mass movements. I would be much more inclined to support that form of changing the world than asking an artist to change it for me. Even me, I don't want to do it. I wouldn't trust myself. I'd want to do it with other people, and who weren't artists. You know, imagine that. Vote the Arty Party. You know, they'll put it right for you. Yes. this will be the last one, I think, because we're going to run out of time. Yeah, I'm aware of what's happening there, and also now what's happening in Manchester, and I find it troubling. It's a model that I think accepts some kind of privileged position for the artist as being, you know, some kind of the privilege of the artist then becomes instrumentalized. So we've got, in a sense, then you're compounding two problems, it seems to me. So the myth of the artist is a problem, and the instrumentalization of art for society is a problem. So in some ways, I am an ally of the history that's drawing on, but I think it's become narrow in the way that I was saying about modernism trying to find the answer, and I think to think that is the answer to me is a problem. It's not. I'm not saying that it's completely illegitimate and it should never be done, but that presenting it in the way that it has been presented is at the very least an overstatement of the social efficacy of art to change the world for the better. Shall we stop? Thank you very much.
Hiya, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm John Orlek. I'm going to introduce some research that I'm doing around housing and artist-led and how they intersect into kind of conversations we're having. And I'm going to focus on collaborative research that I'm doing with an organisation called East Street Arts. So I'm doing a collaborative PhD. It's with East Street Arts and the University of Huddersfield. And I'm also part of an architecture collective called Studio Polpo. So, can't see my notes. So first, it's helpful to provide a bit of context about the research, which is looking at artist-led housing. I'm specifically interested in projects in which there's an artist-led organisation who is acting as a kind of mediator between artists in residence and city stakeholders such as councils, developers, so forth. So it's these are kind of fairly familiar terms. They've got artist-led galleries, artist-led studios, artist-led publishing. I guess in short, what I'm trying to do, obviously this list could be endless, but kind of add ideas around artist-led housing to these debates. There are a number of reasons for doing this, pragmatic reasons, such as kind of precarity, but also practice-based motivations, relationship between art and social change, and also the idea of directing some of the kind of critical functions and behaviours that come with the artist-led sector towards the housing sector and establishing kind of solidarities between different types of housing activism and housing struggle. So as part of the collaboration, I've been following a kind of central case study, which is a pilot project in Leeds, located in a back-to-back terrace house. It's called Artist House 45. And this has involved me adopting kind of, I guess, multiple ethnographic positions in relation to this particular case study. I guess this is the interior of the house when an artist duo called Lord Wilson were in there. It's worth mentioning that the house kind of hosted different types of activities, but it also allowed a kind of blurring of art and life. It meant that making and research and thinking and hosting could kind of all be done together. And housing fits into a kind of a wider program of projects and spaces and activities that East Street Arts are involved with, which I'm starting to kind of map and demonstrate. So I mentioned at the start that I was looking at this kind of type of embedded research role, and I guess I'm using a kind of definition that I'm some kind of team member within the organisation, and that this embedded position allows me to kind of feed research back to East Street Arts in a kind of a live and reflexive way. In addition to these pre-existing definitions, I would probably also add something about having an open brief and being not part of immediate project delivery. I'm going to be writing a thesis. I am writing a thesis, but I guess in response to the kind of the brief for today, I guess I thought it'd be interesting to start thinking about all the stuff that's happening around it, and this includes kind of informal ethnographic methods. It actually also involves me moving into the house as a researcher in residence, and it also includes more performative research, by which I mean bringing into existence the sites and situations in which I'm researching, which I'll come to talk about next, these three next. So in terms of the formal ethnographic project, I've been doing things like attending staff meetings, staff away days with East Street Arts. I've been accessing project monitoring documentation, which allows me to compare different types of projects and start looking at how artist-led housing might differ from things like community-led housing. I've also been kind of undertaking some mapping activities to sort of reveal hidden social and material relationships within the work of the artist Joe Lloyd Wilson, and I've also been incorporating different types of diaristic feedback from artists in residence, but also my own. So as an illustration of this is me on a East Street Arts staff away day. But I guess it gets, I think it is kind of not very serious in a way, but I think a lot of these types of informal social activities have led to me questioning how much I can achieve, or how multiple voices can be incorporated within the body of a PhD thesis, which I'll come to talk about a little bit later. I guess the slightly more established methods like collaborative drawing. This is a drawing of the kind of the origins of the house as understood and interpreted by kind of multiple artists and stakeholders in East Street Arts. And again, I've been kind of mapping this with others, but also kind of writing, starting to write through some of the connections. And I've also been using it as a way of making quite invisible or under the radar activities visible. So with an eye to the fact that there might be some highly visible artistic outputs that are supported by numerous more invisible social relationships. I moved into the house. I guess it's also actually one other thing is that this way of mapping also, because of the House 45 was separate geographically to the East Street Arts' main headquarters in Mabgate in Leeds. This way of mapping actually was used to feed back the research to East Street Arts and actually show them what some of the artists they've been working with have been doing. And this process of kind of feeding back actually did start to inform the programming of the project, which is to say that I'm kind of becoming more implicated in the programming and actually moved into the house. Moving in was an opportunity for me to undertake kind of more situated urban mapping rather than looking at the context from top down. It allowed me not only to observe the blurring of art and life in other artists, but to actually collapse those distinctions in my own work. And I kind of communicated this through a kind of auto-ethnographic first-person story. That's my stuff. I did quite a lot of drawing on the wallpaper, layered drawings in my bedroom, and kind of turned the bedroom into this, I guess, space of production, or I added to kind of more architectural drawings that I'd made of the house. I also started to observe the front garden and how it was used as a social space. And I did quite a lot of these very sketchy, informal drawings and kind of laid them up one after the other. and actually this ended up being used as a way of communicating, communicating this social space of the front garden, which I'm going to talk about a bit next. I guess it links to what I'm going to talk about in a minute. So performative research involved co-organising events with East Street Arts. It involved intervening within kind of their programming role. I took up invitations to exhibit work, and I also collaborated with artists in residence. I organised this event called Housing for Artists, which was looking at more nationwide policy and sort of funding landscape of housing, and looking at how artist-led housing, the barriers and opportunities on a national level. I then kind of burrowed down observed East Street Arts much more closely, and sort of found that there was a danger that discrete residencies weren't being kind of handed over, or information wasn't being carried from one kind of residency to another. And one of the things I did was use some of the information I'd been writing and drawing through my research and residence periods, and kind of create almost like a handover pack, which I handed over to Kerry, who's sat in the audience, as part of her role with Sophie and Kerry, artist duo, moving into the house. And this included layered drawings, and the idea was to sort of start to find ways of developing a kind of more continuous critical practice within East Street Arts that started to see relationships kind of build up and develop and be handed over across discrete residencies. And this actually ended up leading on to a more a collaborative project with Sophie and Kerry. Sophie Chapman, Kerry Jeffries. And we created a table together. It combined kind of top-down with kind of more situated urban analysis, and it was used to kind of host and prompt a discussion about the relationship between planned and unplanned within housing and urban design. And we invited 3 speakers, Sonia Boyce, Andrea Frank, and Marcia Bradfield, to discuss these issues. I'm going to skip this one, but I also was part of an exhibited work in an East Street Art space. In one sense, you could sort of argue that this is a kind of linear movement from being an outsider to a bit of a more, maybe a kind of an insider with East Street Arts with kind of less critical distance from the project. But I think one thing that I've been trying to argue and been demonstrating in different ways is that I've actually been adopting multiple positions at the same time. And I think this has been a helpful strategy for me to start thinking about how to develop embedded and collaborative research in a critical capacity. So these are the different types of positions that I've been adopting that kind of correspond to different types of methods that I've been using. I mentioned it briefly at the start, but I'm also looking at how multiple voices, how these different positions are leading to different types of voice that sit alongside an academic argument, so kind of first person, embedded and embodied kind of writing. So this was a publication I did that looked with other researchers, looking at how more academic arguments can sit alongside more informal responses. And I guess what I'd like to finish on is this idea that I think there's going to be, well, I'm aware of quite a few at the moment, but I think the embedded or collaborative PhDs within artist-led organisations, I think there's going to be more of these types of relationships. And I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is that this type of collaborative or embedded in-house research doesn't just have to involve the management and flow of data, but can also lead to the bringing into the existence both research and new artist-led practices. And I guess the final point is that I guess the adoption of these multiple positions in relation to artist-led housing might be seen as a kind of strategy for establishing solidarities across housing movements. Thank you.
Okay, great. I always notice how everybody else working in the visual arts is incredibly tall. Or maybe it's just that I'm incredibly old and I've shrunk, I don't know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the artist-led, and right at the end I'm going to talk a little bit about why, what I've gained from doing my doctoral research. I've got 10 slides and I plan to take just under 10 minutes. So, but broadly, I have a provocation that says it's really oversimplistic to expect artist-led ventures, especially when they're funded by the Arts Council, to provide any kind of really useful and effective support structure for artist practices and livelihoods over a life cycle. Of course, they don't claim to do this, but in fact there's some kind of an implicit understanding, if you like, within the funding bodies that ticks that box. But I also feel nevertheless that the artist-led, again I'm talking about the artist-led where they receive public funding, could do a lot more to counter the way that arts policy perceives everything from an institutional lens, and in doing so diminishes the role of individual artists and any kind of notion of support directly to artists. So I've, as you can tell, I've been around in the arts for quite a long time. I did a study 25 years ago, particularly of artist-led organisations, and I gave the funding bodies a kind of solution, if you like, as to how they could understand and support those kind of artist-led things. And gratefully, they took it. It seemed to hit a button for them. I'll come back to why that was a bad idea in a minute. I was, perhaps some of you already know, in another life, the director of AN, the Artists Information Company, and during that time very kind of much developed by artists who worked there, who advised, who were on the board, developed the NAN Networking Artist Networks project, which amongst other things provided space for dialogue and also small-scale grant giving, but accepted this more transitory role of the artist-led. It wasn't to do with the building-based. More recently, my doctoral study, which I gratefully finished recently, went back to sort of strip back from any notion of looking at it from any kind of institutional lens by talking at length, in depth, to a very small group of artists to try and find out what actually made it possible for them to continue their practice, whatever that looked like, and whatever market or not they looked to, over a life cycle, not just at mid-career, whatever that ridiculous title, phrase, term means, I have no idea. What my study of the artist-led in 1996 showed was that I looked at 300 artist-led groups, but most of them weren't greater than the sum of their parts. They were multi-occupancy studios, they were workshop facilities, they were what we might loosely describe marketing initiatives. And only 31% of them were engaged in what I call group activity that superseded their individualised activity. There's nothing wrong with that per se, and all those things are important to have. But looking at somebody else's perspective over there on the page, you see the modern version of the subscription model that Dave Beech talked about, where the artist-led neatly fits into the gallery and art market and does what people think they ought to do. I went back and reanalysed, not actually for my thesis, but just out of interest to find out what I did wrong when I looked at artist-led organisations and how they related to arts policy in the past. And this slide encapsulates that. Funding bodies see artists within short-term policy, instrumental delivery, i.e. they value them for what they deliver to other people rather than what they are. But on the other side, the artist-led initiatives are concerned with something much more long-term than that. But there's a muddling of the two once funding gets in the way. I'm indebted, as I always am, to Emily Speed, who drew this ecology picture using data we provided her with. So fast forward, you know, there's something like 47 organisations which the Arts Council funds and designates as artist-led. They tend to be permanent and building-based. That isn't counting people who get project grants, I should say. This is the 4-year regular funding stuck in the millstone of arts policy people. They've in fact joined the system. They may have decided it was pragmatic to do so. They may hope that they can change it for the better from within, and they have to hold their noses when they come across the nasty bits about it. But by doing those things, they inadvertently become complicit in maintaining the arts policy, arts funding status quo, which is by nature over-competitive and unfair. And the dubious practice of recommendation route, which has crept into the visual arts, which undermines the whole notion of equality of opportunity. But I should say that only 11% of all that money that the Arts Council designates to the to regularly funding client goes to the artist-led, so it's a drop in the ocean, really. So those people are upholding, you know, forced, if you like, to straddle between the two worlds, and there's not many of them to make any kind of solidarity. But it does bring me to this notion of how the funding system continually limits down to what itself can manage, and therefore has no ability to see anything beyond that. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the notion of wastage. There's always this mantra, isn't there, about there being too many artists for the market. And it's often, and it's been said to me by people at the Arts Council that, you know, if only the profession was more regulated and so on and so forth, we wouldn't have this problem. Honestly. And because of all this too many artists, if you like, there's what you know, Hans Abing's written a lot about this, this winner-takes-all market. Only small numbers of artists break through these awful kind of thresholds of excellence, whatever that means, and do well. And the majority of artists are just that all that they do is effectively wasted. And I think there's something dramatically wrong about that. I just put up this slide because there's too many artists. You know, there's no more artists than there were 35 years ago. But what there are lots more of is all those not artists. That not artist bit of the visual arts constituency has increased by 42% since 1997. But I don't hear people talking about there being too many directors of operations or too many visual arts marketing staff or too many visual arts fundraising staff or indeed too many bloody curators, as somebody did once say to me, but again only informally, with a different expletive in the middle there. So only maybe 14% of all that constituency of artists are getting any kind of look in to what is funded as the artist-led. So that's the wastage that I was referring to. So one, if artist relevance is only counted as what they deliver to others, we're looking through, I think, the wrong end of the telescope. The other lens of the telescope gives us the whole artist and the gamut of what they offer, accounting for the nuances and multiple values attached to the way they live their personal and professional lives. Artists are first and foremost people. What artists or the artist-led aren't is a limitless talent pipeline. I've seen this in 2 reports recently. Underground, in a pipeline, just popping up when somebody needs you. Seemingly ever grateful, prepared to fit themselves into and manage the emotional stresses and economic uncertainties of highly competitive conditions, accepting of the incessant job seeking, the poor economic terms. They have to be excited. Guard that word. It litters everything, doesn't it? Everything's excited and everybody's excited. You know, I can just see the puddles of we forming as I speak, you know. They've also got to be able-bodied, anchorless and happy to continue to live student lives effectively. Surely one role of artist-led organisations is to uphold the distinctiveness of artists. Artist practices are invaluable precisely because they aren't like the way that arts organisations behave. Arts organisations make a bid for some money, they get some money, they produce a programme, and guess what? They deliver the outputs they thought they would at the end because that's what they're expected to do. The complete polar opposite of the way that artists work. It's a strength not to be output driven, I think, not a weakness to be remedied. So I think one role of artist-led organisations is to do a little bit more to uphold the greater good, if you like, this distinctiveness about artist practice. Because if they aren't, who is? Where are those messages being put over? And one thing that we're really not talking about that we should be talking about is how unreasonably difficult it's become for artists to get small amounts of money, unrestricted money, to just be artists. Why is there nobody lobbying about that? It is an absolute disgrace. This was said to me by a former chief executive of the Arts Council as part of my interviews. The theory of artists being significant in some way or another is always lost in the milieu of what has to be done. But we really do need now to challenge the assumptions that the Arts Council, in particular in England, hold. And they're very conservative and economically, politically driven funding choices, which undermine the whole notion of having a vibrant, active, critical mass of artists who can find a position and maintain a role within their environment over a life cycle. Artists currently have the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, they're self-employed. I gave you the data earlier on. They're much higher percentage of self-employment amongst visual artists than anybody else in the arts and creative industries. But on the other hand, everything that they are offered, or the organisations that they work with, treat them like workers, and we know from all the press about that, how that is demeaning and discriminatory in so many ways. And yet the odd thing is that, you know, they are being treated transactionally in order to put the bread on the table. But they've got to hang around looking like they belong. Biennale hopping being one of those. This is the title of my thesis. Just as a little taster, I'm really not going to talk about it very much. If the contemporary visual arts really wants artists to get ahead over a life cycle rather than just get by, muddling through artistically and economically from one poor opportunity to another, they really need to do some hard advocacy for the conditions which are welcoming and supportive, not just of their own particular venture, but of the constituency of artists as a whole. My research identified that there's 3 core conditions that enable, regardless of the practice that people do, or where they're located, or who they look to, these conditions, these 3 aspects, are what enable those artists to get ahead rather than just get by. So I'm just going to finish up. I'm not going to explain that anymore, there isn't time. There's a couple of don'ts which I would attach to the funded artist-led. I know 1 or 2 of them are here, and I know a lot of you here aren't funded, so please don't take offence, because I'm not directing that to you. Don't condone all the high competition and the business imperatives malarkey that have come to define funded arts organisation, because they just keep artists in their place. Don't treat artists yourselves as a service industry and a talent resource at your beck and call. Don't trivialise in any way at all their nuanced contributions, and by condoning arts funders' unsuitable instrumental measures. By that, I mean to say challenge those instrumental measures and add in other kinds of measurements of other kinds of things. I have to say, when I tried that with the Arts Council, they told me point blank they were not interested and would not use them. And I accepted that. I wouldn't now, actually. So, revolution, please. So, just to end on, I'm really not against the artist-led. It's part of the mix. And I was very interested in Dave's talk. I think that, you know, we learn a lot from positioning what's happening now in the 21st century from within that broader historical context. But I am perturbed about how very few, and it's mainly only building-based, traditionally constituted of the artist-led, get any kind of financial support in exchange for this, pound of flesh, which is to deliver the funding criteria, which is about, you know, what they deliver to audiences. I'm staggered when I get these questionnaires from small-scale artist-led things asking me, you know, whether I enjoyed the exhibition. You know, did I go with my granddaughter, kind of thing. It's so banal, you know, there must be a better way of doing it. I think that the artist-led who have the benefit of funding may fail in a strategic advocacy role of questioning the arts policy and Arts Council England's status quo, and better put forward notions for a far more divergent set of criteria and practices and values, which you will find if you look hard enough into this broad, wobbly, interesting critical mass of artists.
Hello everyone. Cheers for your patience. I was meant to talk at 10. I'm always late. Sorry. And also that thing of all those people leaving, that's normal as well. That's a shit title. That's good. I had a different title that was also awful. I kind of wanted to talk about a number of artist-led experiences I've had very briefly, and kind of tie that into what we do here. So I kind of run the fine art program, or run. I mean, it's a bit chaotic, obviously, because you can see my timekeeping's not great. But to show how we kind of use the sort of stuff that I've got out of other things to in the teaching here, and how students kind of hopefully benefit from some of that stuff. So I've always been really interested in artist-led, meaning artists doing things that aren't happening elsewhere. It's not replicating another thing that already exists, but rather trying to make some new stuff happen. The first of the three things I'm going to quickly talk about is this thing. Look at it, pixelated, it's nice. I was part of an artist group as a student, and it was a response to trying to take control of the degree show, trying to take control of what happens afterwards. Again, there weren't any real templates for us to work to. We just knew that we didn't trust the organisation we were in, which was Central St Martin's, to deliver what we wanted. So we decided to do it all ourselves, and we thought the best way of doing that would be to set up a pretend art group. So we pretended to be a collaborative art group called 20th Century. We graduated in 2000, so there was this miscounting way forward. And in order to pretend we made art, we did things like dance routines in galleries. So this is us in the National Gallery dancing. And one of the odd things that came of all this activity is that people just believed we were an art group, and we got into New Contemporaries, so that was a bit weird, but exciting. And so we sort of decided to go along with this. We also ended up getting a gallery kind of signed us up, like a commercial gallery, so that was odd. So we decided we'd make some work for them and started making work a bit like this. So there's 12 of us in the group. This is us all hiding in our studio. The studio is something I'm going to talk about in a wee bit. So we did lots of things like that. That's us building an escape glider in the loft of our studio. We were under this kind of pressure from the gallery to produce these things that might be saleable in some way. But ultimately, you kind of need to take the power. So that's the show, but we built a 20-foot cardboard squirrel and hid in it because it seemed more pertinent than these like beautifully produced photographs, or not even beautifully, but a bit shit, but there you go. So that's the first one of the kind of things that I'm going to come back to them, each one in turn later, to sort of say where they were successful and where they weren't, and how we then use that moving forward. So the second one is our studio. So you saw a bit of a picture of it before. That's it. It's Limehouse Town Hall. It's not my studio anymore, but I was there for, I don't know, 12 years or something. So a group of us with some other people got hold of that, and we started making bits of work in it. So that's us filming on the back of a big cardboard lorry doing a kind of karaoke film. So we'd use it for that. Lots of films and things got made there because it was a big open space. Again, we got hold of a space that didn't exist. But like studio spaces for the kind of thing we wanted to do didn't exist. So we battered around till we managed to convince the owners of this building to let us muck around in it. So we made a very definite decision not to go for any funding. We funded it ourselves through just working and making it work. We did what we wanted in there. So we had all sorts of things, from events like Itchy Park through to we did have Goldsmiths in at one point. That was a bit weird, but we sort of, mostly they were just kind of odd things that we felt like doing. Lots of films were made there. Sort of fashion stuff. Victor and Rolf turned up, and with Tilda Swinton to do some weirdness. I don't know what that was. But mostly it was just enabling us to make in a way that we wanted to and that other studio providers would never let us do, and also to experiment and chuck stuff out there in a way that you wouldn't be able to do with a normal structure. And the third of the things I'm going to talk about is one of the things that happened there. So that's it. This is a thing called Pilot that I kind of ended up doing. So I had been looking at art fairs. I'd been involved in some art fairs. They were pretty mucky and sort of interesting, but I wasn't interested in much of the art there, and realised that all the artists I was interested in were not commercially viable. They did weirder things. So I just decided to set up an equivalent to an art fair, but for unrepresented or unrepresentable artists. And the mechanism that we ended up using for that was that we'd ask 100 sort of well-known art world figures to represent their favourite unrepresented artists. So you get, and from all over the world. So we get this kind of like huge cross-section of stuff, and we kind of just modelled it in opposition to what art fairs are. So everything's free. It's free for the artists. It's free for the visitors. We had sort of free events, free booze, and tea and coffee, stuff like that. This is the second one, which happened in Farmerlow's building in Farringdon. And that was the party. We do a sort of a booklet for each one of them, what we did is we asked a series of 3 questions and sent them out to everybody and anybody. Anyone who responded, we put their answer in unedited. So this is really key part to what we did. We're not interested in editing or giving a sense of what we think is important. It was very much to do with gathering stuff and putting it there. So if it was crap, if someone had written something in when they were drunk, it went in just as much as any well-considered thing did. And that's what we did with the nominations. So when, I don't know, Hans Ulrich Ubrist nominated somebody, we'd put them in irrespective of whether he'd spent long thinking about it or not. We didn't question whether the artists were good or interesting or not. We wanted this big, unedited kind of cross-section. By the time we did the third one, we were invited out to the Venice Biennale to launch it there. We had a big old space, but not big enough for the show. And we also, the archive, it's basically an archive that grows each time. So by this time, it was 300 artists in the archive. So we ended up doing a catalogue instead, which of course was free. That's it in Venice. That's the space that it's like a quadrangle in a monastery we had to muck around with. And that's the archive in the Farmerlow's building. So we had these kind of a means by which people could very quickly get lots and lots of information about a whole bunch of artists who are doing things that are not being kind of pump-primed by lots of money in terms of sales and things like that. So it kind of made for a really interesting kind of collection of stuff that we ended up with. And the archive itself had a life of its own. It was like a live archive that went touring. So there it is with fake grass and birdsong in the Casa Encendida, and that's in the Chelsea space. So we'd do sort of lots of stuff like that. But if I can just quickly go back to each of those and tell you what went right and wrong with them, that's kind of the point of why I've mentioned them in the first place. So 20th century, it was funny doing shows and our work sold and stuff like that. But ultimately, what we really were was a support group for each other. We kind of made a group almost like our own department at the university. So when we left, we still had it all. We didn't have to, we just had things we could get on with. We had that infrastructure. That continues to this day. We're still all in touch. It's 20 years later. That part of it is really successful. Mucking around with the gallery thing was funny, but it didn't mean much, really. Pilot was reliant on money from various funding bodies, mostly from the Arts Council. It was a nightmare because I guess the policy at the time was that they wanted to make things commercially viable, and the whole bleeding point of what we were doing is that it's not commercially viable. So they kept saying we should be selling work and we should be making commissions and we should be charging entry, and obviously we just had these ongoing fights with them to refuse. So that was difficult and ultimately made it, I just left. I kind of handed it over to the others and ran away because I kind of, it didn't seem like it was worth the battle. which is a shame because it was an interesting thing. I'm also not that interested in archives, they're all right, but you know, there you go. But it's the kind of thing that you have in your head and you kind of, it doesn't exist and you need to at least try it out. So it was kind of interesting doing that. But frustrating in terms of the fact that sort of unlike the 20th century thing, and also unlike the boxing club at Limehouse Town Hall, which was the name of the space we ran, this thing was reliant on other things. So you know, the Arts Council mostly, so in the end the thing collapsed. You know, the others didn't do anything with it, and like I say, I ran away. So the studio is still going strong because the studio is not reliant on anything. We actually got approached a lot by the Arts Council because they wanted to be seen to be kind of supporting us. So that was always quite funny saying no. It's kind of quite nice, but it gave us a great deal of leeway to do what we wanted. And we, you know, I'm not part of that studio setup anymore, but it's still there, operating on the same grounds. There aren't any other places like that I know of in London certainly, and it's you know, it's an interesting thing to have still around, and it kind of exists because it's independent. And I think those kind of lessons are the things that now we try and embed within the teaching on the course here. So a lot of the things we do here in the fine art department are kind of anti-institutional, I guess, which is ironic considering an institution. So we do lots of stuff that's maybe under the radar that the university may not be entirely, is anyone here from? No. That may not be entirely kind of aware of. Because it's just too much work explaining why it's a good idea. It's better to do it and then go, look, that worked. So we do a lot of that. One of the things I've become quite obsessed by is exhibitions. Students in degrees don't tend to do exhibitions like one a year, that's a degree show. We average over 55 a year. It's quite a lot of exhibitions. And most of them are student run entirely. We set up a structure that allows them and encourages them to do lots and lots of exhibitions. So some of them are embedded in the course, some of them are you know, they can be in quite bonkers venues. That's down at Cunard Building. But the idea is that the students will do a lot of shows. They'll understand what it is to show their work, whether they should show their work, if they should have different kinds of platforms. And it means that they become empowered. It means that they become themselves artist-led. We get them to split themselves into groups that form networks that allow them to curate their own degree show. So we don't deal with the degree show, we just clear the rooms upstairs and tell them to get on with it, because they've done loads of shows, and that's exciting and interesting. They're empowered, and they're doing it on their own terms, whatever those terms are. So all of these are examples. That's an example of a bit of first-year work in a show that happened in, you know, sort of, I don't know, sort of 6 months into the course. A bit of MA work, some second-year stuff. So you can see it's just a variety of different places that people are showing in and around the city. Most of the shows are out and about in the city. And this allows people to kind of take control of stuff. So this slide here is a slide of a gallery that one of our students started. He had a normal gallery in the middle of town, which did very well, had lots of openings. Director of the Tate, Liverpool, used to come along to them and so on. But this was more interesting, and obviously it's a Wendy house that you found, and he clad the walls white and the floor grey and called it Gwendolyn because it's posh for Wendy, and it's on wheels and you push it around the city outside other venues that might have, there we go, outside venues that are already having openings. And so this idea that you can kind of already be out there doing stuff is really important to the way that we encourage the students on the course to take control. It's all about taking control and doing stuff, not when you leave, but doing stuff while you're here, so that when you do leave, you have all of the things you need in place to be able to do that. The last kind of thing that we add to that mix is that we've got rid of all the cash prizes, the Amazon vouchers and crap like that, and replaced them with a series of residencies. So we get hold of spaces, we work with TRS, we work with CBS and with Static and Make to have residencies, which are 6-month long residencies that students apply for when they graduate, or when they're graduating, and they can get a space for 6 months. The only rule is they have to have public iterations of whatever they do there. So they can be exhibition spaces, experimental noise spaces, discussion spaces, whatever it is that they feel like doing. We had a whole variety of those. And those things embed themselves in the culture of Liverpool, but also allow people the chance to test out what it is they want to do. It gives them that kind of platform on leaving. I mean, again, the university probably wouldn't be too happy about spending money on people who've left. That's not really what they think should happen, but it seems incredibly important to do that. We've also negotiated a series of prizes with the big institutions here, so Tate and FACT and the Liverpool Biennial. And these are, again, not cash prizes. It's you get 6 hours of time over a given year with the director of each of those institutions. So if you're doing a show, you can go, give us a hand with this. So that's the kind of things we do to make people take control, to make people understand that that idea of artist-led is in their hands. That idea of ambition is not necessarily about being big. It's about being realistic about what you want to do, and making things work on your own terms. Being able to do stuff that isn't there in the first place. And yeah, lots of weird stuff comes out of that. So I'll shut up now. Thank you.
So we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Rebecca. I'm the director at the Newbridge project. So
I already said hello, but I'm PI for this project. Hi, I'm Dr. Rebecca Prescott. I'm a lecturer in entrepreneurship at Northumbria, but I used to be a visual artist.
Hello. I'm Paul Richter, one of the team. I work at Newcastle University.
Do you want me to do this bit?
Yeah.
Okay, just to explain, our team is bigger, but we have brought 4 of us here today. Dan is also part of the team, but he's too charismatic, so we've made him sit down. What we normally do is begin by talking a little bit about the history of artist-run practice. There's no need to do that in the room today. What we would like to say very quickly is the name of our project is more than Meanwhile Spaces, but we are all in favour of Meanwhile Spaces. We're here because of them. We don't want to see them go. What we want is a different kind of offer as well as Meanwhile Spaces. So I will leave that there. Also, we tend to concentrate on workspace in the last project. And that's because we know that cities like London and Glasgow are really getting their act together to support workspace as the most vulnerable but the most crucial part of any, I know you hate the word, Kerry, but ecology. And so that's why we've prioritised that. As part of our project, we've done 2 projects. We'll explain them in a little bit more detail in a second. But we wanted to put this up here first as to why we're doing this kind of work and for who. And we've just noted 13 reasons that come up over and over again, 14 reasons that come up over and over again about why working in the short term can be really problematic for artists and creative practitioners. Most of them have been mentioned here today. It's exhausting. It drains time and energy. I think when Newbridge moved, we worked out that they lost 6.25 years of collective creative time just in the move period, not any of the planning. You can't invest in programs or in people or in audiences or communities. You can't invest in the buildings. There's no point buying equipment because you don't know if you're going to be able to keep it. You lose connections to the place as the idea that artists are just portable and you can pick them up and drop them down somewhere else. You lose your networks of support and expertise. You lose, a great deal of the work is invisible anyway, so it can be very difficult to communicate the value, especially if you're moving. It's difficult to communicate the urgency of that need for long-term support sometimes. There's this massive variety and breadth of practices, which means that we can't just offer councils or funders a one-stop shop and, like, this is the solution, this is the answer, which makes it a really complex area. There are all kinds of assumptions around practice, which Dave started to get into the history of that. There are all kinds of wider socioeconomic narratives and practices, and there is all of that results in this widely documented lack of diversity.
That's me. Oh, it's you.
Yeah. Hiya. So before I was part of this project, the More Than Meanwhile spaces, I spent 5 years writing my PhD research on a meanwhile space, actually a collection of them in Newcastle upon Tyne that we refer to as the East Pilgrim Street block. I'm sure you all are aware of it, have worked within it, are aware of it, probably still in it. So I spent a year within the space doing a very embedded form of ethnography, the same as John Orlek, where I straddle the line between practitioner and academic and researcher in trying to really bring the attention rather from the space and the wider socioeconomic problems that we're facing back to the individual people. So I chatted, I had tea, we wandered around, we cleaned toilets, we built windows, we built walls. And as part of that, I wanted to demonstrate that when I was talking about the artist-led and when we're talking about these meanwhile spaces, that it wasn't just people who came under the banner of artists that I spoke to. This was everybody who I spoke to so far, the way that they self-identified, because I wanted to be quite acknowledging of different people's practices and backgrounds, but just to show the diversity of the spaces that we're talking about when we're talking about meanwhile. And just to, yeah, it's cool. So what I wanted to do when talking about that, bringing it back to the body and back to the person, is to posit the idea that these spaces that we're existed in are a source of actual physical bodily harm. And it's a question that I get quite a lot now that I'm in a business school and I'm removed from these spaces. Why should we care? Why should we put our attention, our focus and our time on these spaces? So I tell the story of the fact that I had a cold for a year, an entire year, the fact that we were on a rotating burnout. It was like some weird calendar where we would plan in advance, okay, so I can do another week of this, and then I'm going to burn out, so you're going to come in that week afterwards, and then you'll probably burn out, and then we'll just rotate it. I just think it's important to bring it back to the body and back to the person again. I've got that quote from one of the people I was working with, that temperature became such a political issue, whether we were either too hot or too cold, or it was too damp, or it was too dry. Hours of conversation, but obviously the temperature and warmth is very important in a practice when you're using your own physical hands. This is the choir I joined as well, just to give you a demonstration. They are fantastic. They still exist even though they've been booted out of the space that they were in at the beginning. Yay. Again, all of these slides are presented as a vignette of the people who I spoke to and their actual experiences, rather than me standing here and espousing that I'm the expert. I wanted to demonstrate their actual lived experience. So we have, the first thing that I'd like to keep it around is this idea of responsibility that is a source of bodily harm, this tension that means that people in these meanwhile spaces, the artists that I spoke to, felt this incredible responsibility for receiving public funding, and because they had that responsibility, they felt like they had to deliver an actual return, and that was one of the sources of burnout that we talked to. That's in one of the buildings there. I've got some images to demonstrate. The bottom one as well, I think it really demonstrates. There's been previous research done in the geographical area I did that posited the idea that all of the people in these spaces were young, early 20s, vibrant, partying all night. And they're not. We had an incredibly diverse demographic of age ranges, of backgrounds, people with or without kids, and not entirely financially independent from moving away. I know a lot of these stories will be stories that really resonate with everyone's experience in here. I would really love to chat about it afterwards because timekeeping. The other theme that this kind of formed around was stability and the idea of having a stable life world, that stable, one core identity, you can't really have a core identity when you're having to be a fund writer and an artist and a curator and a toilet cleaner and a locksmith and a property manager all in one space. It's too much. I love this quote at the top from, are we going to pay the rent? Do I have to work for free? Can I have a child? This particular artist was in an absolute existential crisis because she thought the space she was working in was affecting her ability to achieve what she wanted to through her career. And just because it's a choice to work within those spaces doesn't mean, oh yeah, I mentioned you. Just because it's a choice doesn't mean that limits the bodily effect that it has. Because when she's away from work, she doesn't know who she is. Who am I? So that was the final quote I had on my last day of field work. Radical can only happen when there's no ramifications. But that's never going to happen because there's always going to be ramifications. There's always going to be bodily effect. There's always going to be the way that these spaces are within ecology, an ecosystem. So that would be the last point that I would posit, bringing from here, moving forward to the wider project.
Yeah, so just to talk a bit about why we started doing this project as a collaboration, because I think when we were reading the description for this event, we were conscious that some of the things around co-opting and partnerships were perceived as quite negative, and what we've done is we've formed a collaboration with the university to do research that we didn't have the capacity or the knowledge or the resources to do. So for people who know the Newbridge project, we've in our 10th year now, and we've moved a couple of times. It's cost us a lot of money. We've had to adapt a lot in terms of business model, how we think. It was really interesting reading the sheet that Juliet brought out, because when we had to move, we had to posit a lot of those questions to ourselves about why we existed and what it was for. But also we had to kind of fight to have space, and there's lots of other people in Newcastle and Gateshead in the northeast who are having the exact same conversation. So opposed to like what we're not talking about, it felt like it was all anyone was talking about all the time, and we'd sit around in these quite like exhausting circles where people would complain and moan and bitch, and we'd talk about like all of these different and it was quite competitive, and it was you're getting that space, why are you doing that? And it felt like we really needed to change the narrative, because it was quite like, it just wasn't really very helpful, and we weren't getting anything done. And there'd be people who were like, well, why are we talking about this? We had this conversation 10 years ago, and it's like, right, so why are we still having to have this conversation? So what we realised we needed to do is we needed to start speaking to people who maybe weren't like our natural allies, so people in local authorities, people in councils, people who are arts funders, who maybe have different value metrics and different ways of thinking about stuff to us, but to try and see if we could find like a common ground so that we could start to change how things were going in Newcastle. Because as Rebecca's talked about the East Pilgrim Street block, there's about 500-600 artists in there, and it's all scheduled for redevelopment. So we're conscious that that isn't going to exist forever. So we wanted to start having these conversations. And the first More Than Meanwhile Spaces project that happened last year was about bringing some of those like different people into a room together to have some productive conversations, to think about like what new models might look like and what we needed to change and adapt, and what new things we needed to learn, and help other people to learn about artist-led and studio spaces in the city. Do you want to talk about how that went? A bit more.
We have got there's a PDF booklet. I have 4 paper copies with me. That's all we've got left. There is a PDF booklet that documents all of those discussions and conversations, so that's all freely available. Some of the things that came out of that is that the artists and creative practitioners were like, this is great, we really want to keep working in a way that's generous and open, and that brings other actors into the conversation. Can you do them again? So we looked for money to do that. And also, as a kind of rogue thing, we'd invited various speakers to come in and suggest different kind of models. But we found that the one that really stuck for some reason in that final session was this idea of a creative enterprise zone that we'd got someone from London to talk about. And so we ended up pitching this second project for funding that was across the whole of the northeast and not just Newcastle Gateshead, and that really looked at bringing that network of stakeholders, all different kinds of people together, around the idea of a CZ, but as a vehicle for driving that kind of action and that kind of long-term change. So for anyone that doesn't know, SEZ is part of London's cultural plan to support, save and sustain cultural places and spaces. It's quite specific. They're designated areas. The zones are all different shapes and sizes. It's the creative industries very broadly, so some of them are about fashion, some of them are about artist workspace. And they had to demonstrate, or the local authorities had to demonstrate how they would provide secure, permanent, affordable workspaces. And then these other things as well, so skills and support, how they would develop pro-cultural plans and embed all of that work in local communities. This isn't something that we ever intended to be part of. It sort of just happened and we had to run with it, and we've kind of wrestled with it as we went on as to how useful it is. And that is really where we're at now in the second project. And as part of that wrestling discussion, do you want to pass over to Paul?
Thank you. I'm going to have to remove this.
I think you should bend down.
I'm empathising with, was it Susan, who was speaking earlier about very tall people. I've got the other problem. So this slide, I mean, it's probably a turn-off for lots of people here. I think the point about it is that when we were having these workshops and we were inviting people from local authorities across the northeast, so from different councils, these were often economic development officers, some from arts and culture, but more often from economic development, regeneration, planning, and so on. We, I think, felt a kind of need to try to articulate and use language that reached out to these sorts of parties. And also people from things like local enterprise partnerships, of which I'm sure there's one round here, and there will be up and down the land.
People have all the money.
Well, they have some money, they often want match funding. But, you know, when you... So this slide is, you know, just kind of trying to separate out and articulate different sorts of values that I guess many people would happily agree are associated with meanwhile spaces and artist-led organisations. Arts values, obvious. But when you start talking about, for example, they're great because they develop ecosystems and networks of support. They are social glue. And you're a planning officer or an economic development officer. Those sorts of things, they may resonate in some sense in an abstract way, but they won't help you when you've got to go to a committee meeting and argue for example, a change in planning regulations, or putting aside part of a budget that's already strapped because they can't afford to deliver children's services, for example, and talk about, yeah, but what about the social glue makers? But if you start talking about, you know, jobs and growth in the second column there, then that pricks up ears and it gives a kind of language to people for whom that is their raison d'etre. If you're from enterprise partnership, it's economic development in a particular region that interests you and is your mission. And therefore, if you can associate what artists do in meanwhile spaces with jobs and growth, then they may begin to at least listen, if not appreciate that that isn't the motive or driver for many artists, but you know, that is one of the externalities that is being generated through their activity. Civic value, again, don't need to explain. The last column was my attempt at the last workshop that we did to appeal to the enterprise development kind of audience and to talk about what happens in meanwhile spaces with artist-led organisations could, if brought together with other more commercial, non-artistic, non-creative workers, provide these sorts of benefits. That they have value in a wider sense, in a cross-sectoral kind of sense. So, you know, you need to use words like innovation, which may be a swear word for some people, but I work in a business school, for me it sort of just drips off the tongue. So that's what this is. I mean, for me, it could be a kind of multilinguistic palette, I don't know. I'm making things up now, clearly. But I think the point is, we were grappling with these sorts of things. I think Emma's going to grab the microphone. Yeah, I've said enough.
I have to hold it now. Okay, so we're trying to wrestle with all these different ideas and languages, and we're trying to do it on behalf of a whole region, or including as many people as possible. So we now have 100 people that we have to email every time we have an event. And these are some of the things, I won't go through them, but these are some of the things that the councils, that the funders are telling us. This is why we're listening to you now. This is why we come to your meetings. This is why we're turning up and engaging with them. And these are some of the things that we found when we gave both groups, at one point we had 2 parallel strands, the same grid, that actually there was an awful lot in common already there. There was ground that we didn't have to go through. Nobody thought that we had to appear, and the talent was already there. I don't like the word talent, but it was already there. And it was more this increasing awareness of the contribution that could be made and the problems that were there. And we're trying to push in to drive that as much as we can. There are huge numbers of challenges still in this work. The we is really problematic, even in terms of things like, are we artists or creative practitioners, which is obviously incredibly topical this week, but has been a problem for us for 2 years. How visible are artist-run, artist-led initiatives in the North East? How do we value them? What does the terminology we do use how does it include or alienate people, and how does it set up those expectations of what we're doing? What kind of geography for zoning things in the North East is really tricky. We've got very rural areas as well as very urban centres. What does affordability actually mean when we say we want affordable workspaces? Can we accommodate but not be reduced to an economic kind of cost-benefit analysis? Can we get into that? Can we get to sit at the table but change the conversation? Can we move it? Are there times when we're prepared to be able to use it if it's useful to us at the end? Competitions, huge split on whether that's helpful or harmful, whether it pits colleagues against each other or whether it drives investment. How do we sustain anything in the long term when even when we're talking to funders, it's a 5-year funding cycle. It's not that long term. And we're continuously coming back to this, who is the we, how do we do it? And we'll reflect on that in a bit. Do you want to say next one?
Can I just add
Yes,
something to that?
yeah.
I don't know, I can't remember what it was. Yeah, and it's. I think we feel a bit like this idea came up and people are kind of running with it, and we're not quite sure what to do with it. As somebody who works with lots of artists, the idea of this creative enterprise zone is something that makes me feel a little bit sick, and it's not like terminology that I would ever use or even understand. Like when they started talking about enterprise and everyone's like, oh, we get enterprise, and I was like, I don't even know what that really means. But it's about. So what we're wrestling with is like, do we need to change the language, or actually do we need to change what's underneath the language? And if that language gets people to invest in the infrastructure and culture and in communities in the North East, then that's a good thing. And it's about making sure that what's driving that is like led by like grassroots organisations and the people that are already there, so that the plans aren't about piloting in new stuff, it's about strengthening and investing in what's already there and supporting that. So I think that's the kind of argument that we're trying to make, and it does feel like it's beginning to have some traction. So off the back of this, we've been asked to like support the new North of Tyne devolved regional government in their ideas around creative enterprise zones, and I'm on the steering group for that and trying to get them to not talk about creatives in this homogenised way, because that means that like we might, when they're talking about affordable creative workspace, that's very different to the kind of affordability that we're talking about, so making sure it's more defined. So it's about trying to change some of the stuff that's going on underneath, so it's actually us leading it rather than a kind of top-down approach, even if the term that we might end up using is a bit more top-down. Yeah. Are you gonna... Oh, I've done the wrong thing. There you go.
Yeah, this is probably just a self-indulgent thing, I don't know. I was on the train yesterday, and when I reread your, James's kind of intro to this event, and I saw the word perpetrator, I think something inside me went, ooh, I think that's me he's talking about. Me, because I work at a place like that has those words on it, business school. So do you. So. Are there any others in the audience who work in business schools? Soon you all will be. You do. Soon you all will be. Yeah, I thought I was immune, but it kind of just sucks you in because that's the only place there are jobs in universities. So, you know, I'm thinking, is that me to some extent, and how do I sort of deal with that? You know, I'm guilty of co-opting. I think, you know, I work with people who are closer to the world of art production. I sit on the board of Newbridge. When I'm writing my application for promotion, I put things like, I'm a trustee of an arts organisation. I'm engaging with external organisations. I'm generating value for my business school, and so on and so forth. All the while, obviously, gagging. But I do it. Because I'm nice, really. I'm not the baddie. I don't think. You know, I struggle. Yes, that's what. Who? But I think I sort of represent what, you know, in the case of this project in Newbridge, we have come to collaborate, I think, positively, and I think in the right spirit, and I think we're doing potentially some useful things. But it does take you into different places with different voices. And yeah, I think we're grappling with that. And I don't want to say we should all grapple, because I'm sure we are in all kinds of ways, but I think it says something about how, you know, meanwhile spaces in the northeast of England find they're on this sort of journey with people like me, and people from enterprise partnerships and so on, in a room trying to move the conversation on in some way. And yeah, not to kind of get stuck in the them, us, and the kind of oppositional, antagonistic sort of dilemmas that probably we've been doing for centuries. So that's that bit. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point we were going to make some space for reflections and open it out for questions. Do we still, I'm aware that it is already 5:05 and that people may have families to go home to or trains to catch. Do we want to do this now, or would you prefer us to hang around for a bit, and those of you who can stay around can stay around?
I think if you've got questions, do please ask them. That would be really lovely. Or
we could all go home. As an act of generosity, we could bring this to an end. Just to say that none of us ever intended for it to be like this. We didn't know where it was. It was kind of a leap of faith. And 100 people in the northeast have come into that with us. The group will look different next time we do something. It will be led by whatever is suggested by that group. We will produce some kind of report that is collectively written by over 100 people. We will make that available to you once we've killed ourselves editing it. That will be freely available as well. And if anyone ever wants to get in touch with us to talk about this kind of work, we're all available. We're all really open to talking about what we think has worked, what we've tried and hasn't. But maybe we will save that for another day. Okay. Thank you very much.